While the American Sherman got the reputation of being a death trap, the tank that had it about twice as bad for its crews somehow never got that title. And yeah, we're talking about the most produced and the most destroyed tank of the Second World War, the T-34. So let's go through the whole story from the beginning and show you the horrors of T-34 crews. To understand where the T-34 came from, you have to understand what the Soviet Union had before it and why that wasn't going to cut it. In 1930, Soviet agents were sent abroad on what was essentially a shopping trip for tank technology. They bought several British Vickers export tanks, and they got a license for the American Walter Christie tank. Now, the Christie design was known for its advanced suspension and high speed, but it never actually went into production in the United States. The Americans designed it and then just didn't build it, and the Soviets said, well, we'll take it then. In Soviet hands, the Vickers became the T-26, their infantry support tank, while the Christie design evolved into the BT series of fast light tanks meant to fill the cavalry role, and both types were produced in enormous numbers. But the Soviet Union's industry was still far from developed, and the quality of these early tanks was just poor. And even though they had thousands of tanks, they were just thinly armored and simply not made for any kind of serious fighting. And the proof came quickly. At the Battle of Lake Khasan in 1938 and the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, these light tanks were getting knocked out all over the place, even from relatively modest guns. The Winter War against Finland in 1939 made the picture even worse, and it became very clear that the Soviet Union needed a much better tank. One with real protection, better firepower, and ideally something universal that could replace both the T-26 and the BT series in a single platform. And then on top of all that, the German invasion of France in May 1940 showed the world what concentrated armor could do when used aggressively with these new blitzkrieg tactics. The Soviets watched how the Germans used their Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs and realized that their entire tank fleet needed a serious upgrade. This is where Mikhail Koshkin enters the picture. His first attempt was the A-20, which had sloped armor, a 45mm gun, a diesel engine, and the same wheel and track dual-drive system inherited from the BT series. But the A-20 was still too complicated for mass production. The dual-drive concept added complexity that nobody wanted, so the idea was dropped. Koshkin, though, was convinced that just modernizing the BT concept was a dead end. He went back to the Soviet leadership and proposed something more ambitious. There was resistance from the designers of the KV heavy tanks, who saw it as a direct threat to their own program. But Koshkin pushed through, and a new prototype came out of it. It had thicker armor and improved suspension, and most importantly, a 76 instead of the 45mm gun. That was a huge jump in firepower for tanks of the time. The sloped armor, while not a new concept in itself, was applied more aggressively, and the tank got a V12 diesel engine, whose designer, by the way, was executed in one of Stalin's purges. Koshkin named his creation the T-34 due to the year when he got the idea for it. The tank weighed about 28 short tons, and its wide tracks were specifically made to spread weight across the soft ground, mud, and snow that you get all over the Russian landscape. The diesel engine gave it a top speed of about 33 miles per hour, which was a good turn of speed for a tank of its weight. But before mass production could begin, Koshkin wanted to prove his tank's reliability. So he organized what was basically an extreme endurance test, a roughly 2,000-kilometer road trip with two T-34 prototypes driving from Kharkov all the way to Moscow. Because the project was still secret, the tanks avoided roads and drove mostly through mud and snow. When they arrived near Moscow and were shown to Soviet leaders, the muddy, beaten up but still working tanks pretty much silenced the critics. The journey did, however, expose some transmission problems that would be a cause of headache for crews pretty soon. However, during the winter journey, Koshkin, riding on his tank, exposed to the cold, caught pneumonia, but he stubbornly stayed with his crew for the return trip, despite his health getting worse. He died in September 1940, just as the very first production T-34s were coming off the line, never living to see what his tank would actually do in combat. So what did Koshkin actually create? For a tank of the late 1930s and early 1940s, the T-34 was in many ways revolutionary. Its 76mm gun was powerful by the standards of the time. Its 60-degree sloped armor could stop pretty much anything that anti-tank weapons of the era could throw at it. Just as a comparison, the Germans built all their early tanks right up to the Tiger I with flat, box-like armor. It was only after they ran into the T-34 in combat that they started seriously using sloped armor in later designs like the Panther and Tiger II. Although some sources say the Panther was already in development before the Germans ever met the T-34, so take that with a grain of salt and don't crucify me in the comments immediately. The gun-firing, armor-piercing, composite rigid rounds, basically a tungsten slug inside a wider 76mm casing, could go through about 90mm of armor at 500 meters. And the thickest armor on a Panzer III or Panzer IV at the time was only about 60mm, so that was more than enough to ruin someone's day. But here is where the story gets ugly for the crews, because the T-34 had serious design problems from the very beginning. And besides a few relieving upgrades, almost all of them were only made worse over time. The turret was a two-man design carried over from the earlier A-20, which had been built around the much smaller 45mm gun, cramming the larger 76mm gun and its ammunition into that same space made the turret now extremely cramped. The commander had to command the tank, observe the battlefield, and load the gun all by himself. His only way of seeing outside was a single periscope, which gave him next to no visibility. The official rate of fire was about 5 rounds per minute, but in the chaos of real combat, crews typically got about 2 off. German tank crews, for example, had a commander's cupola, a dedicated gunner, and a dedicated loader in a 3-man turret where they could actually sit without getting a claustrophobia attack, spot their targets, and work synchronized with one another. The turret traverse on the T-34 was electric and quite fast, giving it full rotation in about 10 seconds. But fine adjustment had to be done by hand, as the turret had this annoying tendency to keep spinning after you let go of the traverse handle, which made precise aiming trickier than it should have been. There was also no turret basket, so the floor beneath the turret wouldn't rotate with the turret. The crew had to watch where they put their legs when the turret rotated if they wanted to keep them, and with such quick traverse speed, it was easy to send your fellow crewmen in a wheelchair. Visibility from inside the early T-34 was bad from every position, and we need a better word than bad here, because it was just horrible. The optics were well behind what the Germans had as well. The driver sat in an awkward position behind the frontal slope and needed supernatural strength to shift gears, with the hammer lying nearby in case of the shift stick getting jammed. Or better said, when it gets jammed. The early models also had a bow gunner / radio operator crammed into the hull front beside the driver, and this poor soul could see only through a small hole beside his machine gun. But at least he didn't have to worry about escape hatch. That's because he didn't have one, and let's just say that he wasn't going out quickly if the tank caught fire. His position was removed in later variants, luckily. And speaking of getting out in case of fire, the early T-34 had a single, extremely heavy, one-piece hatch on top of the turret for both turret crew members. It took almost superhuman strength to open, but perhaps you'd be well motivated when the tank was on fire. The driver's forward-opening hatch on the glacis was just as bad, if not worse. Hard to open, even under normal conditions, and it had a bad habit of jamming after a hit. The driver would most likely try to escape through the turret rather than his own hatch. The armor itself, while it was better at deflecting shots thanks to the slope, was made from a steel alloy that was strong but brittle. So even when a round didn't penetrate, the impact could cause spalling, which is basically chunks of steel breaking off the inner surface at high speed and flying around inside the crew compartment like shrapnel. The sloped design also took out a lot of internal space. On top of that, Soviet ammunition was more prone to catching fire, and shells were stored in racks along the hull sides, pretty much wherever they could be crammed, in floor stowage under rubber mats, and with some ready rounds in the turret. There was no wet stowage, or any kind of protective arrangement like those later introduced in the American Sherman to reduce the risk of ammunition fires after a hit. And to top it all off, the fire extinguishers in the T-34 used toxic carbon tetrachloride, meaning that even if the crew managed to put out a fire, they'd still want to bail out of the tank anyway, at least for some time. All of this added up to just brutal survival odds. Soviet tankers lost approximately 2 men killed for every T-34 destroyed. Given that they only had a 3 or 4 man crew, that meant roughly a 50% chance of dying, with some sources suggesting as low as a 20% chance of a crew surviving after a hit. Just to put that into perspective, the American Sherman, which everyone loves to call a death trap, had 5 crew members and averaged only about 1 to 1.3 killed per tank knocked out. So by the summer of 1941, there were only about 900 T-34s in service, alongside roughly 500 KV-1 heavy tanks. The vast majority of the enormous Soviet tank fleet was still the older BT and T-26 types, numbering in the tens of thousands. And the Red Army that met the German invasion on June the 22nd, 1941, was in terrible shape. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had wiped out about 35,000 officers, just gutting the army's leadership at every level. New equipment was only starting to arrive. The force had been expanded too fast, and training was a joke. Practical tank school for new crews lasted as little as 72 hours before being thrown into a tank and sent to fight the most experienced armored force on the planet at the time. The early light tanks were just destroyed by the German advance. Everything pointed towards the Soviet Union collapsing within weeks. But as the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they started running into tanks they'd never seen before. They'd heard of the KV-1 and knew it was a tough nut to crack, but they had no idea the T-34 even existed. When it first showed up in combat, it was a genuine shock. The most common German anti-tank weapon at the time was the 37mm towed gun, which was also mounted on the Panzer III that was supposed to be tank killer. It turns out it was just useless against the T-34, and even the upgraded 50mm gun was struggling to knock out T-34 from the front. There's a bunch of frantic German reports of their guns firing over 25 rounds at a single T-34 until something finally made the crew bail out, like jamming the turret or breaking the tracks. And all while the T-34's 76mm gun could easily destroy almost any German tank of the period. But maybe you wonder why the crew didn't just knock out the gun that fired 25 times at them. Maybe after 10 consecutive shots, they would get the idea of where the fire was coming from and use their powerful gun. Well, the answer is everything we already explained. The crews were barely trained. They could hardly see anything from inside the tank. The commander was overwhelmed. Most tanks didn't even have radios. Only the platoon commander's vehicle would typically have one, and the rest of the crews were supposed to communicate using flags or light signals, which in practice, during actual combat, meant they just followed the lead tank and copied whatever it did. German reports describe Soviet tanks rolling into action without any plan, bunching together, not knowing where the fire was coming from, what they should do, and shooting back inaccurately. The Germans, despite having technically inferior tanks, if you look at the armor and guns on paper, were far better trained and organized. They already knew how to deal with heavy armor, from fighting British Matildas and French Char B1s during the 1940 campaign in France. They adapted quickly, pulling their 88mm anti-aircraft guns into an anti-tank role again. They also used flanking tactics to hit the T-34 from the sides or rear where the armor was much thinner. And on top of the mechanical and tactical problems, there were severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The chaos of the German advance was simply too much. In 1941 alone, the Soviets lost about 20,000 tanks of all types, with over 2,000 of those being T-34s. Some estimates say about half of them broke down before even reaching the fight, and then had to be abandoned. The brief myth of invincibility that the T-34 had enjoyed after those first encounters with the Germans was very quickly shattered by reality. By autumn 1941, the Wehrmacht was outside Moscow, and the Soviet Union was genuinely on the edge of collapse. However, two things prevented that from happening. First, enormous reserves of troops that had been held back near Moscow were thrown into the defense. And second, the entire country shifted into a total war posture where defense production became the top priority above everything else. But to keep the factories running, they had to move them out of reach of the German advance and air raids. So in what might be one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the entire war, the Soviets took apart entire factories, loaded them onto trains, and shipped them thousands of kilometers behind the Ural Mountains to Siberia and Kazakhstan in the middle of nowhere, along with tens of thousands of workers and their families, whose entire life for the next several years was just work, sleep, and repeat, keeping the production lines going around the clock. This move came at a cost, though. For over a month, tank production just stopped completely while everything was being taken apart, moved, and put back together. When the production started up again, different factories ended up building slightly different versions of the T-34 depending on what materials and parts they had available. So you'd get small variations in design and quality from factory to factory. It's said to be almost impossible to find two T-34s built to exactly the same specifications, which also meant that crews couldn't always count on spare parts from one tank fitting another. Once the factories were running safely behind the Urals, the Soviets could build tanks without interruption and at a pace that's hard to wrap your head around. they made the decision that nothing would be changed on the T-34 unless it either sped up production or cut cost. Crew comfort, as you might expect, was not even mentioned. Everything that wasn't absolutely essential for the tank to work was stripped out. The driver's seat was removed, as he could sit on the floor. If there wasn't enough rubber for the road wheels, they went without it. Same went for the paint, optics, radios, periscopes, and everything that the tank could drive and fire without. The number of parts was cut down, armor plates were rearranged so they could be welded faster, and the turret was changed to a hexagonal cast piece that was quicker to produce. And through this just crazy simplification and evolution, the T-34 got its armor thickness and gun penetration roughly doubled, and at the same time, the cost of building a single tank dropped by about 40%. At the height of production, around 1942, Soviet factories were pushing out about 1,200 T-34s every month. Just to give you a sense of what that means, the Germans produced just over 8,000 Panzer IVs over the course of roughly 6 years, and about 1,300 Tigers for the entire war. And this is just T-34s, without even counting all the other tanks and self-propelled guns the Soviets had. As more tanks reached the front from 1942 onwards, Soviet tactics and crew training finally started getting better. The mindless charges without artillery support, or any kind of reconnaissance that you saw in the early war, gave way to more coordinated operations. The Soviets came up with a pattern of attack that became their signature. First, a massive artillery barrage, and then, the moment it lifted, a combined wave of tanks and infantry following at full speed. Infantry rode on the tanks into action, so handles were welded to the hulls for the soldiers to hold onto, and radios started being installed across more tanks. Losses stayed high, but the attacks genuinely terrified German soldiers. By the summer of 1943, especially around the Battle of Kursk, the Germans brought their heaviest tanks to the Eastern Front in real numbers. They also upgunned their Panzer IV and Stug III with a high-velocity 75mm anti-tank gun. Soviet crews were the first to face the Tiger I, the Panther, the Tiger II, and super-heavy tank destroyers like the Ferdinand and the Jagdpanther, where the T-34's 76mm gun just wasn't cutting it anymore. And whatever armor advantage it once had was long gone. And as if that wasn't enough, in the later stages of the war, especially as fighting moved into cities, the biggest threat to tank crews came from something much simpler and much cheaper: the Panzerfaust, a disposable, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that cost almost nothing to produce. The Germans made over 8 million of them during the war, so they were absolutely everywhere. By the later stages of the fighting, Panzerfausts were responsible for roughly 70% of all tank kills, and they actually killed more crew members per destroyed tank than regular anti-tank guns did, because of how the shaped charge worked. For crews fighting in urban environments, every corner could be hiding someone with a Panzerfaust, and there wasn't much you could do about it. So with the T-34's 76mm gun clearly losing its edge, the Soviets started working on a replacement. This led to the T-43 project, which was supposed to keep about 70% of the T-34's parts, while adding better armor, a new turret, and a more powerful 85mm gun. But the T-43 turned out to be a dead end, so they found a better solution. They realized they could widen the T-34's turret ring and slap on the new 3-man turret that had been designed for the T-43 and make it work with the T-34 hull. The result was the T-34/85, which entered service around February 1944. And for the crews, this was now a genuinely different tank to fight in. The new turret was finally large enough for 3 crew members, and the new 85mm gun that came from a Soviet anti-aircraft cannon, much like how the Germans had turned their 88 flak gun to tank use. The T-34/85 now finally had a dedicated gunner and loader, so the commander could focus on what he was supposed to be doing. He got a proper cupola with periscopes. The turret now had a basket, so the crew rotated with it and didn't have to worry about getting their legs chopped off. Now, the 85mm shells were bigger, so ammunition capacity dropped from about 90 to around 50 rounds, but they could now really challenge German armor at range. The hull didn't change all that much apart from thicker frontal armor, brought up to about 90mm. The T-34/85 was still far from comfortable by Western standards, but compared to what horrors these crews had been living in before, it was a completely different experience. By the time the war ended, the Soviets had built approximately 57,000 T-34s of various models. Some sources put the total, including post-war production, at around 80,000, which makes it by far the most produced tank of the Second World War. Second place goes to the American Sherman at just under 50,000. And the T-34 also holds the unfortunate record of being the most destroyed tank of the war, with about 44,000 lost in combat. Behind every one of those losses, there were crews, and a lot of them never made it out of their tank when it was hit.